It is I, Mr. Aaron, and it is 2 p.m., and you know what that means. That means it's time for some more stories. Huzzah! So today, of course, we'll be continuing with Dragonology Chronicles, The Dragon's Eye. So you may remember when we left off last time, Daniel was having to stay home at Castle Drake while his sister was going out learning about dragons in the forest around Castle Drake with Dr. Ernest Drake. And Emery and some friends showed up with this big crate on the back of a carriage, and they loaded it into the coal shed, and it had smoke coming out of it. And Daniel was saying, "Oh, I know that's got to be a dragon." And so he snuck in to take a look at it. When we left off, he was face to face with the little baby dragon. So, that is where we are picking up today. Chapter 7, Scorcher. The first thing that anyone who has ever studied dragons is likely to find out is that they can be extremely unpredictable. It is hard to know whether they will take a liking to you or not, without actually putting yourself at risk. This was only the second time that I had seen a dragon, but from its size I could tell that it was only a baby. I guessed that it had been clawing at the cage because it wanted to get out. But there was something sadder and droopier about it than I would have expected in a terrifying, fire-breathing monster. As I looked more closely, I noticed that it had sticky yellow phlegm dripping from its nose. Yet it was a fascinating creature. Its jet-black eyes were alive with intelligence. I just couldn't resist staring into them. Some time later I vaguely heard Dr. Drake and Beatrice returning from their trip. I heard them go into the house, then I heard them come out again and call my name over and over. They sounded anxious. I should have called back, but I didn't. Oop, lost my spot. But I couldn't. All I wanted to do was look into those black eyes. Something inside me made me desperate to free the dragon. I began fumbling with the lock. Then Dr. Drake burst into the shed and quickly pulled the tarpaulin back over the crate. The moment the dragon was out of sight, I came to myself again. I started to feel frightened and backed over to the door. "I'm sorry, little Scorcher," said Dr. Drake, lifting the tarpaulin just enough so that he could peer underneath it. "I'm afraid you're going to have to stay here until I can get something a bit more fireproof fixed up for you. But I have brought you a treat at last." He took out a bag and pushed 1 or 2 pieces of meat through the bars, which the baby dragon devoured hungrily. He carefully watched it eat, as though he was evaluating its condition. Then he did something really strange. He began to sing to the dragon in a soft, gently lilting song that seemed to send it to sleep. I could not make out any of the words, but it felt strangely comforting. Dr. Drake replaced the tarpaulin and said to me quietly, "You are an extremely disobedient boy, Daniel. You do not have any idea of the disastrous consequences that your actions could have. You have no idea how dangerous creatures like this can be. I had thought that studying some interesting books would have helped you to curb at least some of your insatiable curiosity, but I now see I was wrong. Come and see me in my study at 8 o'clock. Now, have you any questions?" "Can I ask you about the dragon, sir?" I said. "All that I can tell you about the dragon, Daniel, is that he was left on my doorstep in London, and that I have seen him before, that his name is Scorcher, and that he is sick, which is highly unusual for a dragon. I have some skill in healing dragons, however, which is why I have been out in the forest collecting special herbs." "How do you know so much about dragons?" I said. "That is simple, Daniel," said Dr. Drake. "I am a dragonologist." And with that he led me out of the coal shed and back to the house, where Beatrice was very glad to see me. I was still upset that she had spent so much more time with Dr. Drake than I had, so I ignored her by pretending to read about the history of benzene in the manufacturing industries until she said, "Daniel, that book is upside down." "Is it?" I said, without bothering to turn it over. "Of course you won't believe me, as usual." but Dr. Drake is looking after a baby dragon." "I know," she said. Suddenly I felt myself getting really angry. "You know?" I said. "So you believe in dragons now?" "Yes," said Beatrice. "I would never have believed in them, of course, but then I actually saw one in the wild." I was thunderstruck. "You saw one? In the wild?" "Yes, Daniel. The one in the forest seems a bit dumb. I was scared at first, but Dr. Drake says it's all right as long as you are careful." "But why is he teaching you about dragons and not me?" I shouted. "But he will teach you. That's what the summer school is all about. He's just very upset that you went sneaking round his shop without—" "Oh, come off it," I said. "I was looking for him. Could anyone not have looked through that keyhole when they heard all the screeching and roaring? Could anyone not have looked in the coal shed knowing what was inside?" "But dragons are dangerous, Daniel. All you have to do is prove to Dr. Drake that he can trust you, and he will teach you all about them. And I've found out that he isn't a dracacologist at all. He's a dragonologist." "I know," I said. At dinner that night, Darcy joined us for the first time. He looked happy as he came out of Dr. Drake's study. Obviously, whatever errand he had been on had been a success. "So you were going to study dragons too?" he said to us as we waited for the adults to arrive. "Yes," said Beatrice. "Will it just be us three?" "No," said Darcy. "Last year there was another boy. This year he's bringing his sister." "What are they like?" asked Beatrice. "Well, they're rich," said Darcy, "but they're all right. The girl is named Alicia and the boy is named William. Everybody calls him Billy, though. He's got some funny ideas, but don't let that worry you. They're the son and daughter of Lord Chiddingfold. He's a man in the government. He's the minister for—" "Thank you, Darcy," said Dr. Drake, who had just come in. "I'm glad to see you three have been introducing yourselves, but class does not begin for a few days yet." After dinner, at 8 o'clock, I knocked on the door of Dr. Drake's study. "Come in, Daniel," he said. And so in I went. Dr. Drake was sitting behind a large desk with a pen in his hand. "I shall only be a moment," he said. "Do sit down." I sat on a chair facing the desk. Dr. Drake went back to his work. He was writing what seemed to be a very long and formal-looking letter, and I had a chance to look around his study. It had hundreds of books ranged on tall shelves that ran right around the room. On the wall there was a large painting of St. George and the Dragon, and several other small paintings and sketches. At the end of the study, behind the desk, was a padlocked door. But what held my attention was some sheets of paper that lay on Dr. Drake's desk. One was a letter in a thin, slanting hand. The other was a sort of painted diagram of a gemstone. In the very center of the gemstone was what looked like the reflection of an old man with an extremely long beard. Even though it was upside down, I could read the caption above it, which said, "The Dragon's Eye." What also interested me was that I could see the signature on the letter next to it. Ignatius Crook. I am not very good at reading things upside down, but I did my best. I managed to make out a few phrases like, "My dear Ernest," "My father, Ebenezer," and "Our most valuable family treasures," before Dr. Drake put down his pen and shuffled the papers on his desk, so that the sketch of the dragon's eye disappeared from view. Then he stood up, gesturing over to an umbrella stand in the corner, which contained a large assortment of canes, sticks, and 3-foot-long metal rulers. I feared the worst. "Choose one," he said simply. I went over to the umbrella stand with a heavy heart, and chose the lightest-looking cane I could find. I presented it to Dr. Drake with a downcast expression. "But that one's no good, Daniel!" cried Dr. Drake. "What, did you think I was going to hit you? I don't go in for punishments of that sort, my boy. Instead, I have decided I cannot quite trust you at the moment, so I'm going to keep you with me. You will be able to indulge your curiosity to the full. You are going to both see and learn a lot of things that you've never even dreamt of. So you must choose a stick that will be useful for beating back thick undergrowth. You must take the notebook and pencil that I'm going to give you and write Daniel Cook's Dragonological Record Book on the first page, and you must be up and ready to leave the house at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning." After helping me choose a much stouter stick, which looked perfect for beating back even the thickest briars, Dr. Drake showed me to my room and bade me good night. Darcy was already sleeping in one of the other beds. I was very tired too, yet I was so anxious to have my first lesson in dragonology that I have never slept so little in all my life as I had that night. I crept quietly out of the room and was ready and waiting for Dr. Drake in the hallway with my record book and my stick in my hand at 4:30. Chapter 8. Weasel. When he arrived at 5 o'clock, Dr. Drake was carrying the same leather bag I had often seen him carry, a stout stick of his own, and a glass bottle full of some kind of honey-colored liquid, with a label that read, "Dr. Drake's Linctus." He unlatched the front door, and we slipped out. "Daniel," he whispered, "the first lesson a dragonologist must learn is that— Excuse me. Once there were a great many dragons, but now there are far fewer. Only fully grown dragons are indeed— Although fully grown dragons are indeed powerful and dangerous, they are, as a species, no match for human beings. There is a danger that they may even become extinct. So the first lesson a dragonologist must learn is to conserve and protect those dragons that still remain, wherever he can." "Is that what the Linctus is for?" I asked him. "As I told you, Scorcher is sick. It is strange, because dragons hardly ever grow ill, and I have not encountered this particular sickness in dragons before. But the Linctus seems to be helping. Scorcher has brightened up considerably. Soon I'll be able to take him home." "Do you know where he comes from, then?" "Yes." "Did someone steal him?" "I'm afraid so, Daniel. I did not realize until this morning exactly who it was or quite what they wanted. Now I see a great danger is coming, not only for dragonologists, but for ordinary people and dragons, too." "Was it Ignatius Crook?" I asked. "Wait for me here," said Dr. Drake. "I must go and give Scorcher his medicine." When he came back, the bottle of Linctus was empty. Dr. Drake put it down next to the front door. Then he peered at me closely, in much the same way he had peered at Scorcher the day before, and gestured for me to follow him. We headed up the drive and along the path that led into the forest. There we walked silently for some distance. It may have been about 2 miles, before Dr. Drake paused and offered me a cheese sandwich and a drink of lemonade from a bottle that he was carrying in his bag. "Now," said Dr. Drake when we had both eaten, "have you heard of the Knucker Hole?" I had to admit that I hadn't. "It is a very deep pool about 30 miles from here that lies just outside the village of Lyminster, near the south coast. People used to say that the pool was so deep it actually had no bottom. They also used to say that it was the home of a dragon, but only one of those two things was correct." "The part about the dragon?" I asked. "Indeed. The dragon that lived there used to be what is called a knucker. They're quite small for dragons. They're long and thin, and they have small wings and cannot actually fly. But I don't want to tell you too much at the moment, as I need you to find out everything you can on your own. Take out your record book and make a note of your first assignment. Tonight, I want you to make a list of all the differences you notice between the Knucker and Scorcher, who is a European dragon, providing that you can remember much about Scorcher, of course," he said. "I remember Scorcher's eyes quite well," I said. "Really?" said Dr. Drake. "Ha! I would have thought his fangs, wings, tail, scales, or the smoke coming from his nostrils, which really is quite a remarkable phenomenon for such a young dragon, by the way, would have been far more memorable. Now, in order to compare the two dragons, you are going to have to meet a Knucker. And while there is no Knucker at Lyminster any more, there is one here in this forest, which I've been studying for quite some time. When I am at home, I like to make a daily record of her behavior, and I'm going to introduce you. I call her Weasel." "Does Weasel live in a pool, too?" I asked. Oh, no, a knucker doesn't always need a pool. Weasel has a hole in the side of one of the stream beds. Knuckers are very lazy. Weasel is happy living here because the soil is mostly sand, which is easy to dig burrows in, and she is rather partial to rabbit. But I would be careful not to get too close to her until she gets to know you. It is sometimes said that a hungry knucker will take a stray child for its dinner if it finds one. Now, I'm going to tell you no more about knuckers, but I want you to note down everything you see. Dragonology, as I'm sure you realize, is not a very well-known area of study, and most books about it are not at all reliable. So a dragonologist's record book, or dragon diary, becomes his most precious resource, with information on everything he has ever learned or found out about dragons, and notes on all the different things that he plans to find out as soon as he can. When you study a live dragon, it is particularly important to record the time, the weather conditions, the sort of dragon that you are studying, and any dragon behaviors that you note, including whether it can talk or not. I must have looked surprised, and probably rather skeptical at this, because Dr. Drake continued. Dragons are practically the only creatures, apart from humans, and unicorns, of course, that can talk. Not all of them have this ability, however. Knuckers generally don't, but there have been some exceptions. But to find out anything, of course, you have to find the knucker, which means a spot of tracking. Now, why don't you look around? I suggest starting with some soft ground. Dr. Drake gestured with his stick, and I climbed down a steep bank and through some thick undergrowth to where I could hear the trickling stream. I was amazed to discover a set of large lizard-like footprints in the sandy mud. "You must make a record of what those tracks look like, Daniel," said Dr. Drake. "Draw a picture of them, then you'll be able to recognize them again. Try to show how deep the various bits press into the sand, and make sure you get the proportions right." And so I bent down to study the tracks and drew a careful picture of the clearest of the tracks as best I could. There were 3 long, thin toe marks at the front, each with a claw at the end that had made only the lightest of impressions. There was a deep pad mark and another mark left by the beast's single hind claw. When I had finished, I showed my work to Dr. Drake. "Excellent," he said. "Now follow the tracks." So I stepped over the narrow stream and followed the tracks up to where they disappeared among the leafy bracken. "Be careful, Daniel," whispered Dr. Drake behind me. I peered ahead into the gloom and realized that there was something slithering gently ahead of me through the undergrowth. It was the knucker. "Weasel is hunting rabbits," whispered Dr. Drake. "She almost always hunts in the early morning." As I edged forwards, I trod on a stick, which broke with a loud snap and caused Weasel to stop and raise her head. As she turned towards me, I could see that she had 2 bright, snake-like eyes. But her eyes didn't have the intelligence of Scorcher's eyes. "Be careful, Daniel," said Dr. Drake in a loud whisper. "Stay absolutely still." I stayed as still as I could. The knucker, which must have been very used to Dr. Drake by now, glanced over at him and then ignored us. I studied her carefully. She was leathery brown and seemed to have skin rather than scales. I could see 2 little bunches near her front legs, which must have been the useless wings that Dr. Drake had mentioned. Meanwhile, Weasel continued her rabbit hunt. She slithered into a thick patch of undergrowth, her attention fixed on a patch of grass. Several rabbits, which had been disturbed by the noises I had made, had returned to feed. Weasel's head quivered in anticipation as she watched one particularly fat-looking rabbit hop over to join the other 2 on a patch of clover. Suddenly she leapt forwards. Her tail flicked around behind, and her snake-like body curled into 3 loops, which she dropped neatly over the 3 rabbits' heads. Soon they were dangling from the loops in Weasel's body like clothes bobbing on a wash line. Then, with 3 quick gulps, they were gone. The knucker stretched, gave a happy little shudder and wiggle, and then slithered away. "Now," said Dr. Drake when Weasel had gone, "that is your first lesson completed. I would like you to complete the first entries in your record book by this evening, if possible." And with that, we returned through the forest and back to Castle Drake. When we arrived, I found Beatrice sitting at a little table in the drawing room. She was reading a book, and I saw that she had a record book just like mine, lying open beside her, with a dictionary next to it. She seemed to have completed quite a large entry on the knucker already. She looked up. "How was your trip?" she asked. "Did you track Weasel and then watch her hunting?" "Yes," I said. "Well, tomorrow Dr. Drake will probably take you to Weasel's lair," she said, smiling. "I was wondering if you could help me. I'm having a bit of trouble with the idea behind this book. Dr. Drake says that you understand it quite well, but I'm not sure where to begin." She showed the book to me. It was Darwin's On the Origin of Species. "Are you studying that too, then?" I asked. "Yes," said Beatrice. "Dr. Drake says it's exactly the sort of thing a dragonologist needs to understand in order to study dragons in what he calls the proper scientific manner." I felt pleased that Beatrice needed my help, so I said, "Well, as far as I can see, Darwin visited some islands called the Galapagos, where he noticed that different tortoises and birds were slightly different on different islands. So he came up with a theory. All baby animals are born with small differences between them. One may be bigger, another faster, or another may just have a longer neck. If those differences give them an advantage over other animals, defending themselves or finding food perhaps, then they're more likely to survive until they have babies themselves, and the babies will exhibit some of the same traits. Over millions of years, these differences can grow and grow until the animals become so different that they can turn into a completely new species. It's called natural selection." "Oh, thank you, Daniel," said Beatrice. Beatrice went back to reading the book and occasionally looking up words in the dictionary, which was something that, annoyingly, I hadn't thought of when I was trying to read it. I took out my record book and, pencil in hand, opened up a new page and laid out my records as I had been taught by Dr. Drake. When I had completed the record of everything I had seen, I made a new entry listing all the differences between Weasel and Scorcher. And that brings us to a chapter ending, guys. So I think that is where we are going to leave off for today. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please be sure to tune in tomorrow at 2 p.m. as we continue the story of the Dragon's Eye. Of course, don't forget to come in for our new grab-and-go bags that we have this week at each of the 3 buildings. Don't forget to check out our other live programs, Toddler Time with Miss Becky, Stories with Sunny, and Creating with Constance. The libraries are open, but you can still get curbside service if you prefer. And don't forget that you can still access digital content through sweetwaterlibraries.com. Thanks so much for joining me, guys. We'll see you tomorrow.